We have an account in today's gospel reading of the 3 days lost when our Lord was 12 years old. And you know, if you're not too familiar with the scriptures or the life of our Lord, you might think, well, how could they lose their child, right? Especially if you're on a journey, you're obviously going to stay together. But you see, the custom amongst the Jews was that the men would travel together and the women would travel together also. But at the age of 12, when a boy is 12 years old in the Jewish tradition, that's when he becomes a man. And so he's at that transitional age. And so Joseph probably thought, oh, he's with Mary and the group of women because he's still a child. And Mary thought, okay, now he's more mature. He's an adult now. He must be with Joseph and the other men. So each of them assumed that he was with the others. And of course, he had been obedient and, hadn't done anything to cause them concern or worry previously, but he stays behind. And there's a reason as to why he does this. But, I wanted to draw your attention to a passage, and it's the very last verse in today's gospel reading. It says, his mother treasured all these things in her heart. It's not just that she remembered them, but she treasured them as this is a precious memory. Why would she treasure these things in her heart? Here they are searching for him for 3 days, filled with all kinds of anxiety. But Mary treasures this. It's a treasure to her. The memory of this is a treasure to her. And the question is why? So why did our Lord do this, first of all? And part of it was to remind them that he is not an ordinary child, that he must be about his Father's business. But you see, by doing this, our Lord was really preparing Mary and Joseph, and especially Mary, for a future 3 days loss that they would have to endure. So he was actually strengthening them. So in the case of Mary, when Christ is crucified, he's in the tomb, and it's only on the third day, after 3 days, that he appears to her again. And, in the gospel accounts, we have our Lord appearing to Mary Magdalene first, but the speculation of many scholars is that he probably appeared to Our Lady first, but that wasn't a public event. It was a private event. Because he loved her so much, he knew how much anxiety and grief she was filled with, so he would have appeared to her first. So by means of this 3 days loss at the age of 12, he was preparing Mary for this future 3 days loss when he's crucified and in the tomb and only rises on the third day. In the case of St. Joseph, just the separation from him. So, the tradition is that St. Joseph died before our Lord began his public ministry. So he would be deprived of our Lord until our Lord ascends into heaven or enters into heaven. And not just that, but you see, this event doesn't just benefit Joseph and Mary. This event actually benefits all of us also, because it's one of the ways in which our Lord enabled both St. Joseph and Our Lady to understand what we go through, for example, when we might fall into mortal sin. When we fall into mortal sin, we are separated from Jesus. We are separated from God. And we might be filled with anxiety, with worry, what are we going to do? And of course, we need to go to confession. And so where do we search for God? Well, he's in the temple. He's about his Father's business. So we need to come to the modern day temples, the church, and go to confession, which is where we find Jesus in the sacraments, in the sacrament of confession, and of course in the sacrament of the Eucharist. So God wanted Mary and Joseph to be able to relate to us because they are our greatest intercessors. Certainly, Our Lady is the greatest intercessor for us because she is the closest to Jesus. Secondly, St. Joseph. Now, in the case of Mary, God had prepared her to become the mother of the Messiah, and so she was conceived immaculate. She was free from any stain of sin at her conception, but also throughout her life she was free from all stain of sin. She didn't even commit the slightest venial sin. And this is very noteworthy because why is God doing this? Well, yes, he wanted her to be a vessel through which God comes into the world, through which the second person of the Trinity comes into this world. But he also wanted her to be able to have perfect love for Jesus, for God, but also for all of us. So this immaculate heart of hers enables her to love all of us with a very great love. Now, it's not as great as the love of God, certainly, but it is a very great love. And you know, when we think of mothers, the love of mothers is a beautiful thing. So often fathers are seen as the disciplinarian. It's not that they don't love, but the mother is more the one who comforts the child when the child is distraught. And so the mother is seen as the heart of love. So the heart of Mary is the place for us to receive comfort. It's the place where Mary can comfort us and lead us to Christ. And St. Louis Marie de Montfort, as you know, he's an expert on Mariology, and he's written a number of works, True Devotion to Mary, and other great works. But he says that the love of Mary for her children, for us, is greater than if you were to take the love of all the women who had been mothers from the beginning of the creation of human beings until the very end, and added them all up. It would not equal the love that Mary has for us, her children. And recall the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima. And Our Lady of Fatima said that God wishes to establish devotion to her Immaculate Heart. Why does God want to establish devotion to her Immaculate Heart? So that we will receive her motherly love, so that we will receive the graces that flow through her to us, but also so that we can be led to imitate her Immaculate Heart. So how do we acquire a more pure heart? So our hearts will never be totally immaculate except when we're in heaven. But how do we acquire a more pure heart here and now? And the key is to say no to sin. Say no to selfishness. Say no to pride. But also saying yes to the will of God. And saying yes to the will of God sometimes entails saying yes to difficulties in our lives. But you see, when Mary experienced these difficulties, she didn't get upset. She didn't complain. She didn't blame God, as many people do today. In fact, it says she treasured these things in her heart. She treasured this difficulty because she understood that through this difficulty that she and Joseph experienced, she would receive certain blessings that would benefit her for later in her life, but also benefit all of us, or in other words, enable her to have a greater compassion, a greater understanding of our state when we are deprived of the presence of God in our lives. So we don't always understand why God allows certain things to happen to us, but if we trust in God, then God will give us the graces that we need to work through those difficulties and hopefully to grow in virtue, to grow in goodness, and attain to a higher degree of glory in heaven. And of course, to help us to do this, God sends his Blessed Mother to us through many apparitions, by the Church giving us this feast to honor her Immaculate Heart, to think of her as our spiritual mother, and to ask her to intercede for us, but also to go to her for comfort and consolation. Not because we want to take anything away from our devotion to God, but God created us as social beings. We all interact, and the good that we do to one another has a great impact. You know, why would God, you know, when we think of the works of salvation, why would God become man and only have a 3-year public ministry? Why didn't he do it for 6 years or 7 years, right? Like, he could have done so much more. He could have accomplished so much more. But no, he wants to do things through other human beings. So he sends out his apostles. And he continues to use human beings in the world today to speak the truth, to manifest love, but also those human beings who are in heaven who intercede on our behalf. And the more that we invoke them, the more they will intercede on our behalf. And this is why we should invoke Our Lady and be very close to Our Lady, because she is the one who leads us to Christ. She is the one who brings Christ to us. Just a brief announcement, a reminder that today at 4 p.m., the Legion of Mary will be conducting the Living Rosary here in the parish church, and you are all invited to participate in that. That's this afternoon at 4 p.m.